I've been a sheriff in Texas for nearly 20 years, and let me tell you, there are some things you never get used to. The heat, sure. The long nights, the wide open roads, the strange calls that come in from people who live too far off the beaten path, who spend too much time alone with their thoughts. You get used to all that. But there are some things that get into your bones, crawl under your skin, things you can't shake, not even after all these years. I've worked my fair share of patrols, and I've seen things, heard things that no man should ever have to. But there's one night, one shift, that I'll never forget. It was about 3 years ago. It started off like any other night. A quiet evening on the job, which, out here in West Texas, can be both a blessing and a curse. When you patrol these parts, you don't expect much excitement. You cruise the highways, check in on the small towns, and keep an eye out for any trouble. But you learn to trust your instincts. And on that particular night, my instincts were telling me that something wasn't right. I was driving down Route 80, heading toward the outskirts of a place called Harland. Nothing but endless miles of dirt and tumbleweed between me and the next town. Harland had been quiet for the past few weeks, and I figured I'd stop by the old gas station just outside town, maybe grab a coffee, stretch my legs. Just as I was about to pull in, my radio crackled. "Sheriff, we've got a 1022, possible disturbance at the old Marshall place." I knew the Marshall place. It was an abandoned farmhouse just a few miles outside Harland. The house had been empty for years, ever since old man Marshall had passed away. The place was a local legend, you know. People said strange things happened out there, weird noises at night, lights flickering in the windows when no one was home. I'd heard the stories, but I never gave them much thought. Still, when dispatch called it in, I felt a tightness in my chest. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just another false alarm. I turned the car around and headed out toward the Marshall place. The further I drove, the thicker the air seemed to get. It was like the night itself was pressing in on me, heavier and heavier with every mile. I pulled up to the property and parked about 100 yards away from the old house. It was dark. Too dark, if you ask me. The kind of dark that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you are. The wind had picked up, kicking up dust and debris from the cracked earth, and the trees nearby swayed like they were reaching for something. I stepped out of the car and surveyed the place. The house looked the same as it always had, decaying, abandoned, a relic of another time. The windows were boarded up, the front porch sagging with age. But tonight, something was different. There was a faint light coming from one of the cracks in the boards, a soft, flickering glow, like candlelight, or maybe the last remnants of a dying fire. I approached the front door cautiously, my hand resting on the sidearm at my hip. I didn't expect anyone to be inside, but you never know. I knocked once, then again. No answer. I pushed open the door with a creak, stepping into the pitch-black hallway. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I took a few steps forward, the sound of my boots echoing in the emptiness, and then I heard it. A whisper, soft and barely audible at first, but it grew louder, closer. It was a voice, deep and guttural, but not human. Not right. "Get out, or they'll come for you." My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't run. That's not what we do. I kept moving forward, my instincts telling me to get to the source of the sound. The voice didn't repeat itself, but I could feel it, creeping into my thoughts, making my pulse race. I followed the voice to the back of the house, where a narrow staircase led up to the attic. The light I had seen earlier was coming from there, flickering through the cracks in the floorboards. My hand gripped the railing as I made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The attic was small, cramped, and the air up there felt colder than it had any right to be. The light was coming from a single candle, placed on the floor in the center of the room. And around the candle, drawn in the dirt, was a circle. A symbol, one I didn't recognize, but something about it made my skin crawl. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw them. Two figures standing in the shadows. They were tall, impossibly tall, with their backs to me. Their heads were shaved, and their clothes were tattered, like they'd been out here for years. But it wasn't their appearance that terrified me. No, it was the way they stood. Completely still, like they weren't even human. Just empty shells, waiting for something. One of them turned, just slightly, enough for me to see its face. It was pale, too pale, with skin stretched tight over the bones. Its eyes were wide, black, like they were staring into my soul. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice hollow and distant. I backed away slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for my radio, but the static was all I could hear. I couldn't get a signal. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I knew I had to get out. I spun around, but when I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the attic had closed behind me. I pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't have to look. I knew they were coming closer, those figures, those things that weren't human. I could feel them closing in. I don't know how I made it out of that house. One minute I was trapped in that attic, and the next I was standing outside, gasping for air, heart hammering in my chest. The figures were gone. The house was still. I got in my car and left. I didn't report it. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I never went back to that place. Never drove past it. Sometimes when the wind picks up, when the night is especially still, I still hear their whispers, as if they're waiting for me to return. And I know, deep down, I'll never truly be free of them. Those things are still out there, and they're watching. I've been a sheriff in this godforsaken Texas town for over 25 years, seen things that would make a preacher drink. There's a lot of empty land out here, a lot of places for bad things to hide. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you find them. Or worse, they find you. One of the worst nights of my life started with a simple call, domestic disturbance. I knew the house before the dispatcher even finished talking. Old man Brady's place, way out on Farm Road 92. He was a mean son of a bitch, and his wife Lorraine had called us a few times before. The last time, she had a black eye and a busted lip but refused to press charges. Just stood there on the porch, shaking her head like she was too damn scared to say yes. I rolled up to the house just past midnight. It was quiet, too quiet. No porch light on, no sign of Lorraine peeking out through the curtains like she always did when we showed up. My gut told me something was wrong. I stepped out of the cruiser, hand resting on my holster, and knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again. "Brady? Lorraine? It's the sheriff." Still nothing. That's when I noticed the smell. Something rotten. Something that had been sitting too long in the Texas heat. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The living room looked normal at first glance. TV still on, some old cowboy movie playing, but there was no one in sight. Then I saw the blood. A long smear of it across the floor, leading into the kitchen. I drew my gun and followed it. Lorraine was there, sitting in one of those old wooden chairs at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for something. Her head was tilted back at a sickening angle, her throat a gaping, blackened hole. Her face, Jesus, it wasn't just cut up, it was carved. Symbols I didn't recognize were dug deep into her skin, the cuts jagged like they'd been done with something rusty. And Brady? He was hanging from the ceiling. The old bastard had a noose around his neck, body swaying ever so slightly like there was a breeze in the room. But the windows were shut. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, right in my ear. "Help me?" I spun around, gun raised, but there was no one there. Just empty space and that rotten smell getting stronger. Then Brady twitched, not just from the rope. His head lifted, his eyes, cloudy, dead, locked onto mine. And he smiled. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Running out of that house, getting in my cruiser, and tearing the hell out of there. The official report said murder-suicide. Said Brady killed Lorraine, then himself, but I know better. I saw what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. A week later, Deputy Collins stopped showing up for work. I went to check on him, and his wife said he hadn't left the bedroom in 3 days. Just sat on the bed, staring at the wall, whispering to himself. She said he kept saying the same thing, over and over. "They're watching." She found him that night, hanging from the ceiling fan. Same symbols carved into his skin. After that, I stopped asking questions. Some things in this job you don't chase. Some doors you don't open. And when you hear a whisper in the dark, you don't turn around, because sometimes the dead are still listening, and sometimes they smile. I've been the sheriff of a small town in Texas for more than 30 years now. You might think that after all this time, I'd be used to the strange calls, the weird happenings, the eerie sights that make you question if you're still in the real world or if you've slipped into something darker. But the truth is, the longer I've been doing this job, the more I've realized that some things, some places, don't ever let go of you. It was late one summer night when it started. Real late, well past midnight, and I was cruising down Highway 20, a stretch of road that cuts through miles of nothing but dusty land and the occasional patch of mesquite. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has just stopped breathing. I had my usual patrol route, nothing out of the ordinary, but then the radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, you copy?" It was Carla, dispatch. Her voice was tight, like she was trying not to sound rattled, but I could hear it. Something wasn't right. "Yeah, Carla, what's up?" I replied. Slowing the car as I kept my eyes on the road. The headlights barely lit up anything more than a few feet ahead. "You're going to want to check out the old Jenkins place. We got reports of noises, strange ones, people saying they saw something moving around in there." I frowned. The Jenkins place was an old farmhouse about 10 miles out of town, long abandoned. People said it was haunted, but you know how it is around here. People will see ghosts in every shadow if they've got enough whiskey in their system. "All right, I'll head out there. You heard anything else? No, Sheriff. Just the usual calls about lights and movement. But be careful. There's something off about it. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just some kids messing around, playing pranks on the locals. But as I turned my car down the dusty road that led to the Jenkins place, I started to feel that weird unease creeping up my spine. I've had it happen before, that feeling like you're being watched, like something's just behind you, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I chalked it up to a bad gut feeling, but the hairs on the back of my neck weren't lying. The Jenkins farmhouse loomed in the distance, a broken-down structure that looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint in decades. It was all sagging wood and broken windows barely standing. The moon was a thin slice in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. As I parked the cruiser near the edge of the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The wind had stopped entirely, and that's when I heard it, a faint scraping noise like something dragging across the floor inside the house. I hesitated. My hand went to my gun. I knew I should have waited for backup, but I was the sheriff. This was my town, and I wasn't about to let some damn prankster get the best of me. I pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The front door of the house was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind with a soft creak. I moved toward it, my boots heavy on the dirt. I called out as I stepped inside, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sheriff's office, anyone here?" No answer. I took another step, and then another. The house smelled old, musty, like decay. There were old wooden floorboards creaking under my feet as I made my way through the hall. Everything felt wrong. The air was thick, and it seemed to pulse with something I couldn't name. I heard it again, the scraping sound, this time coming from upstairs. I started up the stairs slowly, my flashlight illuminating the darkened hallway. At the top, there was a door halfway open, and the sound was clearer now. It was like something was being dragged across the floor, something heavy, like furniture or a body. I reached for the doorknob, and that's when it happened. A scream, sharp and loud, echoed through the house, so real, so close that it made my heart lurch in my chest. I swung the door open, my gun drawn. The room was empty, but not entirely. The floor was covered in old, dry blood like something had been dragged across it. A shadow flickered at the far corner, just out of the reach of my flashlight. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just a space, empty, cold, and impossible. I could feel something in that room, something that shouldn't be there. I stepped forward, my mind racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Hunched, tall, and wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, its eyes were wide open, but they weren't human. Not anymore. They were black, full of nothing, like voids that pulled everything in. It was staring at me, unblinking. Before I could react, it spoke. "Leave this place, Sheriff. It's not meant for you." I don't remember much after that. There was a sound, something like a growl coming from behind me. A second figure. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside. My cruiser was still parked where I left it, the lights flashing in the distance, but the house, the Jenkins place, was gone. Not just abandoned, gone. Like it had never been there at all. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't know what I felt. But something is out there. Something that knows how to make itself disappear, and it's been waiting for someone to come close enough to see it. I don't talk about it much. Hell, I don't talk about it at all. But there's a piece of me that's never quite been the same since that night. It's a piece of me that feels like it's always being watched. And maybe, just maybe, it's still watching me now. I've been a sheriff in Texas for 24 years now. Some people might think it's a tough job, but to be honest, it's the quiet that gets to you. The long nights out here in the dust and heat, the isolation. After a while, you get used to it, but there are times when that silence feels too heavy. And then, every once in a while, you get a call that shakes you, makes you question the things you thought you knew. I'm not talking about the routine calls either. I mean the ones that keep you up at night, wondering if maybe there's something else out there, something that shouldn't be. It was just after midnight when it happened. I was patrolling the stretch of highway just outside of our town, the road winding through the dark and desolate landscape. No other cars in sight, just the occasional gust of wind that carried the smell of dust and dry earth. My headlights cut through the night, casting long shadows across the road. I wasn't expecting much. This stretch was quiet most nights, except for the odd deer that might wander too close to the road. But something felt off tonight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I turned on the radio to pass the time. Carla, our dispatcher, was talking about something, but the static made it hard to hear. I could make out something about a call coming in from an old farmstead, the kind of place that hadn't seen people in years. The Hickory place, about 10 miles out of town. I'd heard rumors about it. Everyone had. They said the place was cursed, built on land where something bad had happened, something that never really went away. But it was just a ghost story, right? Some locals still said it was haunted, but I didn't buy into that kind of talk. Still, Carla's voice sounded off, like something was bugging her. She told me to head out there and check things out, just to be safe. She said she didn't feel right about it. "Sheriff," she said over the radio, "you should probably take a look, just in case." I didn't argue. Just another empty house, I thought. Another spooky old building with a story behind it that wasn't worth telling. I told Carla I was on my way and clicked off the radio. The drive out there was like something out of a bad dream. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the edges of the asphalt disappearing into nothing. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the old truck's suspension. The further I went, the darker it got. No streetlights, no signs of life. Just endless rows of dry grass, hills rolling in the distance like silent sentinels. And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about what Carla had said. Something wasn't right. When I pulled up to the Hickory place, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an old car parked in the driveway, maybe kids sneaking in to get high or whatever, but there was nothing. The house loomed in the distance, a faded silhouette against the black sky. The windows were dark. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges like it was waiting for someone to come inside. I got out of the truck, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it felt weak, like it couldn't quite push the shadows away. The house seemed to suck in the light, making it feel even darker than it already was. I didn't hear anything. No creaking wood, no rustling leaves, just silence. And in that silence, something felt wrong. It was a gut feeling, a primal instinct. I'd spent enough time out here to know when things didn't feel right. I walked up to the porch, the boards creaking underfoot. The door was still ajar, barely swinging in the breeze. I called out, but my voice seemed small in the emptiness. "Hello? Sheriff's office." Nothing, just the wind. I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. The house smelled old, musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. I could hear the creak of the floorboards as I moved deeper inside, the flashlight illuminating the dust and decay. The furniture was gone, stripped away, leaving only the skeletal remnants of a past life. I made my way down the narrow hall, the walls buckling with age, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound like a whisper, but it wasn't a voice. It was wrong, a kind of breathing, like something was moving, something that shouldn't be. My pulse picked up. I drew my gun, the cold metal heavy in my hand. The noise was coming from upstairs. I moved cautiously, my steps slow, deliberate. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step echoing in the silence. And then, at the top of the stairs, I saw it. A figure, a shadow standing just at the end of the hall. It was tall, too thin, the shape of a person, but not quite. It was like it was stretching, like it was trying to reach up to the ceiling, its limbs too long, too angular. The light from my flashlight hit its face, and I wish it hadn't. Its eyes were black, empty, like there was nothing behind them, just a hollow space. Its mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile, but wasn't a frown, either, just a sharp, unnatural curve. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice scraping against my skull. I froze. The air turned cold. I couldn't move. The thing took a step forward, its long arms reaching out toward me. My body was paralyzed, but my mind was screaming. I fired. Twice. The shots rang out, deafening in the small space, but the figure didn't flinch, didn't move. It just kept coming. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Vanished. The hallway was empty again. I stood there, my gun still raised, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds, it could have been hours. But when I finally moved, I didn't want to. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't want to stay either. I stumbled back down the stairs and out of the house. I didn't even look back. When I got back to my truck, the world outside seemed normal again. The air was warm, the sky still dark, the road stretching ahead of me. But I knew something had changed. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what I heard. But I do know one thing. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things don't belong in this world. And I saw one of them that night. I'm not the same sheriff I was before, and I don't patrol the outskirts of this town anymore. Some things should be left alone. Some things should stay in the dark. I've been a sheriff for nearly 20 years now down in Texas. You'd think I'd get used to the long hours, the empty stretches of highway, the way the stars look like they're about to fall right on top of you at night. But I haven't, and I don't think I ever will. There's something about this place, the land, the air, that feels different when the sun goes down. It's not just the heat that lingers or the humidity that makes the night heavy. No, it's something deeper, something that watches. I've had my share of calls, some more normal than others, animal problems, drunks, fights, things that happen in small towns. But some nights, some calls, they get under your skin. They change something inside you. And that's what happened to me that one night. A night I'll never forget. It was a Wednesday, nothing special. The sky was clear, just the usual endless Texas stretch of road stretching out before me. I just finished a check on the border when the call came through. A woman had called in saying her truck had broken down out near the old dirt road that runs through Buckhorn Creek. Not a lot of traffic out there. Maybe it was just some car trouble. But she sounded scared. Her voice frantic. "Please, Sheriff, you gotta help me. There's someone out here. I hear them. Please," she begged, voice shaking. Oh, I thought it was a prank. People get scared out here, and sometimes their minds start to play tricks. But something about the way she said it, the fear in her voice, made me grab my keys and head that way. You learn to trust your instincts when you've been doing this job long enough. The road to Buckhorn Creek was isolated, and the air seemed to thicken the further I drove. The wind picked up, rattling the few branches left on the bare trees. It felt like something was holding its breath. I called it into dispatch, just in case. Let them know where I was. It's always smart to have backup, even if you don't think you need it. The moment I hit the area where she said she was, I knew something was wrong. The truck was parked on the side of the road, lights off, engine cold. No sign of the woman. I checked the area, walked around the truck, but there was nothing. I called out, "Ma'am, you out here?" Nothing. That's when I saw it. Just past the truck. On the edge of the trees, I thought I saw something moving. A shadow, maybe an animal. But when I looked closer, I could make out the figure of a man standing still, watching me. "Hey!" I shouted. "You need help?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tall, looming, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I took a few cautious steps forward, my hand resting on the gun at my hip. That's when the wind shifted. I heard something that shouldn't be possible, something that made my heart skip a beat. A low whisper. "Help me." I froze. It wasn't the woman's voice. It wasn't a voice at all, really. It was just a sound, a cold, unsettling murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The figure didn't move, didn't speak again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. I reached for my radio to call in, but the static was unbearable. No signal, just that creeping whisper growing louder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I stepped back, heart racing. The figure finally moved slowly, like it was shifting out of place, but instead of walking toward me, it started to fade, just melt into the shadows. And when it was gone, I felt that tightness in my chest, the one you get when you realize something isn't right, something you don't understand. I called for backup, but when the other deputies showed up, they found nothing. No woman, no man, no trace of anyone. The truck was still there, but it was like the whole thing had been a ghost story, a figment of my imagination, or at least that's what they wanted me to believe. But I couldn't shake it, couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back the next night, a little braver, or maybe just a little more desperate for answers. I drove the same route, parked the cruiser, and waited. And waited. Hours passed. The only sound was the wind through the trees. I could feel the air getting heavier, colder. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw something. A shape in the distance. A figure, standing in the same spot I had seen the night before. This time, though, I didn't shout. I didn't move, I just watched. It wasn't a man, not really. It was something more, something darker. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were just black pits. No light, no depth. And that voice? It wasn't human. It was a scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard sending a cold wave of terror over me. It wasn't until it spoke again that I understood. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a person. It was something that had been here long before we ever stepped foot on this land. And it was still here, still watching. Leave now, or be taken. I didn't need to be told twice. I didn't even think to call for backup. I just left. I left that place behind and never went back. The deputies who were with me the next day found nothing. No figure, no signs of anything unusual. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Something out there is old, something that's been watching and waiting, and I have no doubt that it's still out there. I don't patrol that stretch of road anymore. I don't go near Buckhorn Creek. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that whisper. Leave now, or be taken. I've been a sheriff in Texas for over 20 years now, and you get used to the heat, the long hours, the solitude. But there are nights when the darkness feels heavier, thicker, like it's pressing against your chest. Nights when you get the feeling that something is waiting for you, watching you from just beyond the reach of your headlights. I can tell you about the strange things I've seen, the calls I've answered, the odd reports from the townsfolk. But there's one patrol, just one, that still rattles me to this day. It started like any other night. I was cruising along Highway 50, heading out toward the western edge of the county, where the flat desert stretches as far as the eye can see. There are no streetlights out there, no signs of life, just miles of dirt and scrub brush. Most people don't come out this way unless they have a reason, and the ones who do are usually up to no good. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I got the call. Dispatch said there was a possible break-in at an old ranch outside of town. The ranch had been abandoned for years, left to rot after the owner, an old man named Mitchell, had passed away. The place had a reputation, a bad one. People said it was haunted, that old man Mitchell's ghost still roamed the land, keeping watch over his property. It was the kind of place you didn't go near after dark, unless you were looking for trouble. I wasn't too worried about it. The ranch was miles away from the nearest road, and I figured if someone had broken in, they'd probably be gone by the time I arrived. But something gnawed at me, deep down. A feeling, like the air had thickened with something wrong. I couldn't shake it, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. The road was a long stretch of asphalt, cracked and worn from years of neglect. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the soft whine of the tires against the pavement. When I turned off the main highway and onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, it got even quieter, the night swallowing up every sound. The ranch was set back from the road, surrounded by a rusted fence that had long since fallen into disrepair. The house itself was barely standing, a decrepit wooden structure with sagging roof beams and boarded-up windows. I parked the patrol car a little ways off, cut the engine, and grabbed my flashlight. I walked toward the front door, every step crunching against the gravel. It was dead silent, not a single animal stirring in the distance. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer, no movement from inside. I tried the handle. It turned just enough to let me push the door open. The smell hit me first. It was a mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. There were no signs of forced entry, but the place felt wrong. The air was too still, like it had been waiting for something to happen. I moved through the house, slowly, checking each room. Nothing. The place was empty, just as I'd expected. But then I heard something, a soft scrape, like something shifting in the dark. I stopped dead in my tracks, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It came from upstairs. I knew I should have called for backup, but something told me I was too far in, too deep into whatever was going on here. So I crept up the stairs, one step at a time, the old wood groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I saw a light flickering from under a door at the end of the hallway. It wasn't a normal light, though. It was faint, yellowish, like a candle flame dancing in the breeze. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over my gun, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked on the door. No response, but I could hear something now, whispers. Soft, indistinct voices, like people talking, just out of reach. I pushed the door open. What I saw made my stomach twist. The room was dark, but the walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood like someone had carved them in a frenzy. There was a small wooden table in the center with an old chipped candle burning at its center, and sitting at the table was a man. He was facing the wall, his back to me, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but they were too rhythmic, too deliberate, like a chant. I cleared my throat and he turned around. His face was pale, almost sickly white, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. His clothes were ragged, torn in places, and there was something wrong with the way he moved, too slow. Like he was dragging something behind him, something heavy. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you need to come with me. This place isn't safe." He didn't respond at first. He just stared at me, and for a moment I thought he wasn't even aware I was there. But then he spoke. "They're here," he whispered, his voice rasping. "They're coming." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. No one. Just me and this man, sitting at the table, eyes wide and empty. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. My flashlight flickered and then died completely, plunging us into darkness. I could hear movement in the room now, slow and deliberate, like something shifting in the corners, something breathing. The man stood up, and that's when I saw it. His legs were twisted, bent at unnatural angles, as if his bones had been broken and reset, over and over. His arms hung by his sides, limp and lifeless, but still, he moved toward me. "They're here," he whispered again, his voice shaking. "They're coming for you. You should have never come here." I backed away, my hands fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't open. My gun? Where was my gun? I turned around, but there was no time. No time to think, no time to react. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a rustling from the corner of the room. And then I saw them. Figures, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the dark corners, their faces hidden by shadows. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I could feel their presence pressing in on me, closing in from all sides. I don't know how I got out of that house. I really don't. But I remember running as fast as my legs would carry me. I remember the sound of something following me, but when I looked back, there was nothing, just the house, dark and empty, standing like a sentinel in the night. I never went back to that ranch, and I never will. I don't know what was in there, what I saw, or what was chasing me. But I know one thing for sure, there's something in the darkness out here in Texas, something that watches from the shadows. And once you've seen it, it never leaves. Not really. It follows you, no matter how far you run. I've been a sheriff in this dusty old Texas town for over 20 years, and I've seen some things that could make a man's soul wither. The kind of things that don't make the newspapers. The ones that get brushed under the rug because nobody wants to believe them. But I remember. God help me, I remember them all. One night, around 3 in the morning, I was driving down a lonely stretch of road just outside of town. The stars were out, bright as hell, but the night was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the coyotes were howling. I was sipping cold coffee from a styrofoam cup when my radio crackled. Unit 5, respond. We got a 1091V, possible stray or injured animal reported near Old Creek Road. Homeowner says it's making an awful racket. I sighed. Middle of the night, some drunk probably hearing things, but duty's duty. I took a turn down Old Creek, headlights carving through the black. The road was rough, barely more than dirt, and the trees on either side twisted into each other like they were whispering secrets. I saw the house up ahead, an old one-story thing with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. I stepped out of my cruiser, boots crunching on dry leaves, and heard it. A sound that stopped me cold. It was crying. Not a baby, not quite. It was off, like a recording played a little too slow, stretching each wail into something unnatural. My skin crawled, but I followed the sound around back. There, tangled in the wire fence, was a thing. I say thing because it sure as hell wasn't a coyote, and it damn sure wasn't human. It was hunched, skin too pale for an animal, too stretched for a person. Its limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin. And its face, it was like looking into something half-formed, like God started making a man and got distracted halfway through. Its eyes were black pits, too deep, too empty. The thing turned its head, slow, deliberate, and then it spoke. Help me, it said, but its mouth didn't move right, like a dog trying to form words. Please, help. I drew my gun, heart hammering in my chest. Stay where you are. The thing made a sound, half whimper, half chuckle. It shuddered, body convulsing, and then, I swear on my life, it started to change. Its arms thickened, its face twisted, and before I could even blink, it looked like someone I knew. Me. It was me, standing there, staring back at me with dead eyes. I fired. The thing screeched, a noise so sharp I thought my damn ears would burst, and then it bolted into the woods, moving faster than anything had a right to move. I stood there, gun smoking, breath ragged, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I called it in, but when backup arrived, there was nothing but blood on the fence and deep claw marks in the dirt. I knew better than to push it. Some things in this world don't need to be found. The second time something like this happened was a year later. A trucker called in, said he'd picked up a hitchhiker out on Route 37, young woman, long dark hair. Said she was real polite, real quiet, until she wasn't. She just disappeared, Sheriff, the trucker stammered when I found him at a gas station, shaking like a leaf. 1 second she was sitting there, next she was gone. Left the seatbelt buckled, man. That ain't normal. I checked the truck myself. Sure enough, the seatbelt was fastened like someone invisible was still sitting there. The air smelled strange, metallic, and wrong. I asked the trucker where he picked her up. He pointed to Route 37 near mile marker 12. That was the same spot where, 10 years ago, a girl matching that description had been found strangled in a ditch. Unsolved case. One of mine. I never did find out who killed her. I told the trucker to forget about it, go home, hug his wife. That night I drove past mile marker 12. My headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A woman, standing in the middle of the road. I didn't stop. There are things in this job I can't explain. Things that make me sit awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how deep the darkness really goes. But one thing I do know, out here in this empty stretch of Texas, there are places you don't stop, people you don't pick up, and cries in the night you don't answer. Because sometimes the dead aren't resting, and sometimes they're looking for company. I've been a sheriff in this dusty Texas town for almost 30 years. You do this job long enough, you start thinking you've seen it all, Meth heads who think they're bulletproof, drunks who swear they saw Jesus in a gas station parking lot, husbands who take a little too much pleasure in beating their wives. But there are some nights out here, some calls you take, that stay with you long after you hang up your badge. It was a little after 2 in the morning when the radio crackled to life. Unit 7, possible 1071 out on Route 46. Witness reports gunfire and screaming. No additional units available. I sighed, rubbed the exhaustion out of my eyes, and hit the gas. Route 46 is a long, lonely stretch of highway, cutting through the mesquite and nothingness. A bad place to get stranded, a worse place to die. It took me 15 minutes to reach the mile marker the dispatcher had given me, and when I pulled up, there was nothing there. No cars, no bodies, just the wind and a sky full of dead stars. I stepped out, radioed in. "Dispatch, I'm at the scene. No sign of gunfire. You sure about this call?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, caller refused to give a name. Said it was a woman screaming. Then the line cut out. I let out a breath, scanned the roadside. That's when I saw the dirt, disturbed like something had been dragged off the asphalt into the brush. My stomach turned to stone. I pulled out my flashlight, followed the marks into the dark. About 20 yards in, I found the first piece. It was a hand. Just a hand. The fingers were curled like they'd been reaching for something when they were cut off. The skin was pale, too pale, like all the blood had been sucked right out of it. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and kept walking. Then I found the rest of her. She was hanging from a tree, strung up like some kind of twisted marionette. Her arms bent wrong, her head tilted at a sickening angle. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide, like she'd been frozen mid-scream. I stepped closer, and then she moved. Not like a body should move, not with bones broken in half. It was a jerky, puppet-like motion, her limbs twitching as if something invisible was pulling the strings. And then she looked at me. Her mouth started moving. No sound came out, but I swear to God, I knew what she was saying. "Run." I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs, and I swear I felt something behind me. Not a person, something bigger, colder, the kind of presence that presses down on your soul like a stone. I turned, gun raised, but there was nothing. Just the wind whispering through the trees. When I turned back, the girl was gone. The rope dangled empty, swaying slightly, like something had just let go. I ran to my cruiser, floored it back to town, and didn't look in the rearview mirror. The next morning, I went back, brought deputies, crime scene tape, the whole deal. There was nothing there. No rope, no blood, no hand, just empty road and the wind. Officially, it was chalked up to a prank call. Unofficially, I started locking my doors at night, because sometimes, out here in the dark, you hear things you're not supposed to, and sometimes they hear you back. I've been a sheriff in this godforsaken town for over 20 years. It's the kind of place that doesn't make it on the map unless something goes wrong. My job's been mostly quiet. The kind of quiet that can turn deadly in a second. And it's not always the kind of danger you see coming. Most times it's just lurking in the dark, waiting for you to get close enough to step right into it. I'll never forget the night it all changed. It started like any other patrol. I was driving down Highway 35, way out past the county line. The moon was full, hanging low in the sky like a dead eye. It's a stretch of road I know well, nothing but brush and dirt for miles, with only the occasional ranch house lit up in the distance. The radio crackled to life. Unit 9, report of a disturbance at the old Miller farm. No details. No backup available. Please respond. The Miller farm. I hadn't heard that name in years. The Millers had moved away when I was just starting my career. There had been rumors about the place being haunted, about strange lights and noises coming from the abandoned farmhouse at night, but no one in town had bothered with it in years. Still, it was my job, so I flipped on the sirens and headed that way. I could feel something in the air. You get that feeling sometimes, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Not from the cold, not from fear, just from something else, something you can't put your finger on. When I pulled up to the old Miller house, I didn't see anything at first. The place looked as empty as I remembered, windows boarded up, the porch sagging like an old man's back. But then I heard it. A sound, a low hum, coming from inside. I turned on my flashlight, walked up to the front door. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached, and the hum grew louder. It wasn't music, it wasn't a radio. It was like breathing. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. Then the door creaked open on its own. I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like something had been rotting in there for years. My flashlight swept across the room. Empty, just old furniture covered in dust. But the humming? That was still there. It seemed to be coming from the back of the house, from the kitchen. I walked toward it, every step heavier than the last. When I turned the corner, I froze. There, Standing in the middle of the kitchen was a woman. Her back was to me. Her hair was long, black as midnight, and she wore a dress that looked like it belonged to another time, something old-fashioned. Her hands were raised, palms facing out, like she was trying to keep something at bay. The humming had stopped. But then I heard her whisper, "Help me." I didn't move. Didn't know if I should run or if I should speak. But before I could make a sound, she turned. Her eyes, Jesus Christ, her eyes. They weren't human. They were black. No pupils, no white. Just two endless pits of darkness. And her mouth stretched too wide for a human, like something had ripped it open from the inside. She stepped toward me, slowly. I backed up, my hand on my holster, but my gun wouldn't come out. The world seemed to slow down, like I was caught in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The woman, no, it wasn't a woman, grinned. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Heavy, slow. They weren't mine. I turned around and saw there were more of them. Figures, shadowy and tall, standing in the doorways and the corners of the room, just out of the light. All of them staring at me with those same empty eyes. I ran. I didn't care what happened to the house or the people inside or anything. I bolted for the door. But as soon as I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The world was different. The stars in the sky were wrong. They weren't where they should be. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, like it was giving way. I was lost. I ran and ran, but every time I thought I was getting somewhere, I'd end up back at that damn house. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just those people. It was something older than time itself. I finally collapsed in the dirt, exhausted, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, I was back in my patrol car. The radio crackled. "Unit 9, report status. Did you find anything?" I glanced around. The house, the woman, the shadows, they were all gone. The road was empty. I didn't answer the radio. I didn't know what to say. I drove back to town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me, something that I couldn't outrun. And now, every time I pass that stretch of road, every time I'm out there in the dark, I feel those eyes on me again. I hear that whisper, "Help me." And I know that no matter how many years I work this job, no matter how many calls I take, I'll never be rid of it. Because some things in this town never leave. They just wait. And one day, they'll come for you. I've been a sheriff in this part of Texas for nearly 25 years. The job, you'd think, would lose its edge over time. The stories, the calls, the nights, eventually they blur into one long stretch of dark roads, neon-lit diners, and bad whiskey. But some calls, they stick with you. They burrow under your skin, and no matter how hard you try to forget, you can't. And it's not always the calls where you find something, where the danger is clear. No, the worst ones are the ones where you don't find anything at all, or worse, where you find too much. I'll start with the night I drove out to that old gas station off Highway 9. It wasn't much more than a shack in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place you'd pass by without a second thought unless you needed gas, and even then, you'd be in and out as fast as you could. But this night was different. I got a call just after midnight. The radio crackled to life, and it was the dispatcher, voice shaking. "Unit 3, we've had reports of a disturbance at the old service station on Highway 9. You're the closest unit. Please respond." At first, I thought it was just another prank, maybe some teenagers getting drunk and trying to spook the old man who ran the place, but I had to check it out. That's my job. So I pulled on my boots, grabbed my hat, and hit the road. The air out here is always thick, but that night, it felt heavier than usual. I don't know how to explain it, but there's a weight to the silence in the Texas desert. The wind doesn't blow the same way out here. It's like it knows something you don't, like it's waiting for something. When I got to the station, I didn't see anyone. The gas pumps were rusted, the lights flickered like they were about to give up, and there was that old dry smell of oil and dust. Everything about the place screamed abandonment. But the door to the office? It was wide open. I stepped out of my patrol car and walked up to the door, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't even want to go inside, but I had no choice. The dispatcher hadn't heard back from the last unit that was sent out there a few hours ago. No one was answering the radio. Inside, it was dark. The kind of dark that makes you feel like something is just out of sight, waiting for you to get too close. I flicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Papers scattered on the counter, an old cash register covered in dust, and behind the counter, what I thought was a man at first, hunched over, motionless. "Hey," I called out. No answer. I took a step closer. Something felt wrong, like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I shone the light directly at him. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. There was blood on his shirt, the kind of blood that doesn't belong to just one person, you know? And then I saw it. The blood wasn't just on his shirt. It was smeared across the walls in jagged lines, like something had dragged its hands across the plaster. There was a smell, too. Something rotten. Something that didn't belong to this world. I reached for my radio, but when I turned to call for backup, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, hand on my gun, heart pounding. The room was empty. No man. No blood. Just the stench and the cold that came with it. I don't know how, but I knew something had been there. Something that wasn't human. Something that had been waiting for me. The door creaked open again, and I stepped back out into the night, my mind racing. I told myself it was a prank, that I was seeing things. But when I got back to my car, I saw something that stopped my heart cold. The gas station was gone. Not destroyed, not burned down, just gone. All that was left was an empty stretch of road in the quiet. I didn't know what to think. But I knew one thing. I had to get out of there. I radioed back in, telling them everything was clear, but the dispatcher didn't believe me. She told me no one had ever called in about a disturbance at that station. I didn't go back there again for a long time, but I did hear about it. I heard the same thing from other sheriffs who'd been out that way. They'd all gotten strange calls, just like I had. Some of them had seen the gas station, others hadn't. But none of them had ever been able to explain it. And none of them had ever been able to go back. There's something out here in the land of dirt and dust, something that doesn't want to be found. You can drive by it 100 times, 1,000 times, and never know it's there. But once you see it, once you step too close, it'll never let you go. That's what I've learned after all these years. Some things, they don't have explanations. And some nights, you just have to pray that you make it through to the morning. I've been a sheriff in a small town in Texas for 27 years. A lot of things have changed over the years, but the one thing that's stayed constant is that the job doesn't get any easier. You see things out here, things that stick with you, things that make you question if you're really prepared for what's out there. When people think of Texas, they imagine vast open spaces and dry heat. They imagine wide highways and flat, unbroken horizons. What they don't realize is that there's something else hidden in those spaces, something dark. Something that only shows itself when the sun sets and the shadows start to stretch. It's not always clear what it is, but you know it when you feel it. You know when the air gets thick, when your heart races, when you look into the rearview mirror and swear there's something following you, even if you're sure there's nothing back there. I remember one night, in particular a night that changed everything. I just wrapped up a shift, driving back from a small call out at the county line. Nothing special, just the usual speeding tickets and loose dogs. But as I made my way back into town, the radio crackled to life. Dispatch called my name. Sheriff? It was Carl, the dispatcher. His voice was sharp, urgent. We've got a situation out near the old highway. We're getting reports of something strange. Now, Carl's a solid guy, but he's not one to get rattled easily. So hearing him sound the way he did, that didn't sit right with me. I pressed the gas down harder, heading toward the call without asking too many questions. You learn pretty early in this line of work not to ask too many questions. Just go. Do the job. When I pulled up to the area, it didn't look like much. Just a stretch of old highway, barely a road anymore, with weeds creeping over the asphalt. There was an old abandoned motel on the left, a place that had been shut down for years. It was dark, the kind of dark that clung to your bones and made every noise seem louder, closer. I didn't like it, not one bit. I stopped the cruiser at the edge of the property, lights flashing across the faded neon sign. For a moment, it was like everything went quiet. No wind, no rustling. Just a strange, still silence that didn't belong in a place like this. You expect the wind to blow out here. You expect the desert to hum with life, even if it's just the sound of a coyote or the rattling of an old metal sign. But that night, nothing. Just silence. And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The dry earth cracked beneath my boots. I walked toward the motel, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the door, it creaked open like it hadn't been touched in years. I should have turned back then, should have radioed for backup. But something in me, maybe it was the years of being a sheriff, the need to always answer the call, something pushed me forward. Inside, it smelled like dust and decay. The floor was covered in old furniture, broken chairs, and torn curtains. But there was something else, a strange metallic smell that I couldn't place. I moved deeper into the building, careful to keep my flashlight steady. That's when I saw it. A man, no, not a man, not anymore, was sitting in the corner of the room. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring into nothing. He was twitching, spasming in a way that made my stomach flip. His clothes were torn, blood-stained, but not fresh blood. It was old, dried, the kind of blood that shouldn't have been there at all. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stood there watching him. And then he spoke, his voice like gravel, rough and dry. "They're coming for you." I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But when I looked back at him, his eyes shifted. Not just a blink. No, they shifted, like they were following something I couldn't see. I turned to leave. Fast. But the door slammed shut behind me, and I stumbled, almost falling. My hand reached for my gun, but my fingers were shaking too badly. My breath was coming too fast. I was panicking. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel something. Something in the air had changed. And then, from the shadows, I saw them. Figures. Tall, unnaturally tall, standing in the corners of the room just watching me. Their faces were blurred, like someone had tried to erase them, but they were still there. I could feel their eyes on me, feel them reaching for me. "Sheriff," one of them said, its voice hollow, like it came from the bottom of a well. "You shouldn't have come here." And I don't know how I got out of that motel. I don't know how I made it back to my car. But I did. And when I got in, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove. I drove without stopping. I never spoke to Carl about it, never mentioned it again. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That feeling of eyes watching me, following me. It's been years, and it still lingers, like a shadow that never quite leaves. I've been back to that stretch of highway since, but the motel is gone. Vanished. Like it was never there in the first place. Some things, some places, they don't let you go. Not ever. And that's the thing about this job. The scariest thing? It's not always what you see. Sometimes it's what you can't see. What you don't want to see. But it's always there, watching, waiting. And when you least expect it, it comes for you. I've been the sheriff of a small town in Texas for more than 30 years now. You might think that after all this time, I'd be used to the strange calls, the weird happenings, the eerie sights that make you question if you're still in the real world or if you've slipped into something darker. But the truth is, the longer I've been doing this job, the more I've realized that some things, some places, don't ever let go of you. It was late one summer night when it started. Real late, well past midnight, and I was cruising down Highway 20, a stretch of road that cuts through miles of nothing but dusty land and the occasional patch of mesquite. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has just stopped breathing. I had my usual patrol route, nothing out of the ordinary, but then the radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, you copy?" It was Carla, dispatch. Her voice was tight, like she was trying not to sound rattled, but I could hear it. Something wasn't right. "Yeah, Carla, what's up?" I replied. Slowing the car as I kept my eyes on the road. The headlights barely lit up anything more than a few feet ahead. "You're going to want to check out the old Jenkins place. We got reports of noises, strange ones, people saying they saw something moving around in there." I frowned. The Jenkins place was an old farmhouse about 10 miles out of town, long abandoned. People said it was haunted, but you know how it is around here. People will see ghosts in every shadow if they've got enough whiskey in their system. "All right, I'll head out there. You heard anything else?" "No, Sheriff. Just the usual calls about lights and movement. But be careful. There's something off about it." I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just some kids messing around, playing pranks on the locals. But as I turned my car down the dusty road that led to the Jenkins place, I started to feel that weird unease creeping up my spine. I've had it happen before, that feeling like you're being watched, like something's just behind you, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I chalked it up to a bad gut feeling, but the hairs on the back of my neck weren't lying. The Jenkins farmhouse loomed in the distance, a broken-down structure that looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint in decades. It was all sagging wood and broken windows barely standing. The moon was a thin slice in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. As I parked the cruiser near the edge of the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The wind had stopped entirely, and that's when I heard it, a faint scraping noise like something dragging across the floor inside the house. I hesitated. My hand went to my gun. I knew I should have waited for backup, but I was the sheriff. This was my town, and I wasn't about to let some damn prankster get the best of me. I pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The front door of the house was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind with a soft creak. I moved toward it, my boots heavy on the dirt. I called out as I stepped inside, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sheriff's office, anyone here?" No answer. I took another step, and then another. The house smelled old, musty, like decay. There were old wooden floorboards creaking under my feet as I made my way through the hall. Everything felt Wrong. The air was thick, and it seemed to pulse with something I couldn't name. I heard it again, the scraping sound, this time coming from upstairs. I started up the stairs slowly, my flashlight illuminating the darkened hallway. At the top, there was a door halfway open, and the sound was clearer now. It was like something was being dragged across the floor, something heavy, like furniture or a body. I reached for the doorknob, and that's when it happened. A scream, sharp and loud, echoed through the house, so real, so close that it made my heart lurch in my chest. I swung the door open, my gun drawn. The room was empty, but not entirely. The floor was covered in old, dry blood like something had been dragged across it. A shadow flickered at the far corner, just out of the reach of my flashlight. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just a space, empty, cold, and impossible. I could feel something in that room, something that shouldn't be there. I stepped forward, my mind racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Hunched, tall, and wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, God, its eyes were wide open, but they weren't human. Not anymore. They were black, full of nothing, like voids that pulled everything in. It was staring at me, unblinking. Before I could react, it spoke. "Leave this place, Sheriff. It's not meant for you." I don't remember much after that. There was a sound, something like a growl coming from behind me. A second figure. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside. My cruiser was still parked where I left it, the lights flashing in the distance, but the house, the Jenkins place, was gone. Not just abandoned, gone. Like it had never been there at all. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't know what I felt. But something is out there. Something that knows how to make itself disappear, and it's been waiting for someone to come close enough to see it. I don't talk about it much. Hell, I don't talk about it at all. But there's a piece of me that's never quite been the same since that night. It's a piece of me that feels like it's always being watched. And maybe, just maybe, it's still watching me now. I've been a sheriff in Texas for over 2 decades now, and if there's one thing I can say for sure, it's that this job, this life, changes you. You start out thinking it's just about following the law, keeping the peace, but after a while, it's not the law that keeps you up at night. It's the things you see, the things you hear when you're alone in the dark, the things that just don't make sense no matter how hard you try to explain them away. Some nights, out here in the wild, flat nothingness of the Texas countryside, the silence gets to you. And sometimes, that silence is worse than any noise could ever be. I remember one night, late October. The sky was heavy with clouds, like a blanket smothering everything below. It was a night that felt wrong. It started out like any other. The kind of night where you expect nothing more than the hum of the radio, the occasional deer darting across the road, and the empty highway stretching ahead of you, stretching into that thick blackness that feels like it could swallow you whole. The call came in just after midnight. A car broken down off Highway 27 about 10 miles from town. Nothing special. We get calls like that all the time. A flat tire, engine trouble, someone too drunk to drive. But when I pulled up, something was off. The car was there, sure. But it wasn't just any car. It was an old Buick, rusted and faded. One of those models that looked like it hadn't been on the road in years. The headlights were on, but the engine wasn't running. There was no one around. I got out of my cruiser, the dust from the road sticking to my boots as I made my way toward the Buick. The air was still, like the world was holding its breath. I looked around. Nothing. Not a sound in the air. No crickets, no wind, just silence. I knocked on the car window. No response. I tapped harder. Still nothing. "Hey, you all right in there?" I called out. I wasn't expecting anyone to answer. No one ever does when the car has been abandoned. I leaned in through the open window, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The seat was empty. There was a bag of fast food on the passenger seat, but no sign of anyone. No driver, no passengers, just that eerie silence. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispering from somewhere behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm, but there was nothing. No one, just the empty road, stretching out into the darkness. My heart started racing. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't right. There's something about being out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I checked the car again, hoping I'd missed something. Anything that would make sense of what had just happened. But no, the back seat was empty. Just more of that trash and a couple of old magazines. I walked back to my cruiser, keeping my eyes peeled for anything. The night felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me, waiting. I slammed the door shut behind me and tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the trunk of the Buick. I froze. I don't know why I didn't just get in my cruiser and leave. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I thought I'd finally found a good reason to end my patrol for the night. Had something to report other than a busted engine. I don't know. But something made me walk back toward that Buick, toward the trunk that was now making that sound like something, or someone, was tapping from the inside, desperate to get out. I grabbed the handle of the trunk. It was cold, slick with dew, but I didn't hesitate. I opened it. The smell hit me first. A rotten, putrid smell, like something had been left to decay for days. The flashlight in my hand flickered as I shone it into the trunk, and there in the darkness, I saw it. A man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was hunched over, curled into a ball like he'd been trapped in there for hours, maybe days. His clothes were torn, his face covered in grime and dirt. His eyes were wide open, staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stared, like he'd seen something far worse than the things I've seen in my 20 years as a sheriff. But there was something else, something worse than the man himself. I felt it before I saw it. Something in the air, heavy and cold, like the very ground beneath my feet was shifting, buckling under the weight of I don't know what. Before I could move, the man's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a grip that was impossibly strong. His nails dug into my skin and he opened his mouth, but instead of a scream, there was only a low, guttural growl, like an animal that hadn't eaten in too long. And then, through his teeth, he whispered, "It's not over. Not yet. It never ends." I pulled away, stumbling backward, my heart racing. The man, if that's what he was, stayed in the trunk, staring, watching me as I backed away. I ran back to my cruiser without looking back, got in, slammed the door shut, and drove off. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart still thundering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked outside the station, and even then, I sat there for a long time, just trying to calm myself down. But that's the thing about this place, about this job. You can't escape it, you can't forget. You think you've seen it all, but you haven't. Not yet. The next morning, I went back to the spot. The Buick was gone, just gone. There were no tire tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. It was like the whole thing never happened, like I imagined it, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard. And that man, that thing, is still out there. I don't patrol those roads much anymore. And when I do, I keep my eyes on the shadows. Because in this part of Texas, the night is never truly quiet. And some things are better left undisturbed. I've been a sheriff in Texas for almost 30 years now, and in all that time I've seen things that would make your skin crawl. You get used to the isolation out here, the endless roads that stretch into the horizon, the dead silence that feels like the whole world is holding its breath. But after a while, you start to realize that silence isn't always a good thing. Sometimes it's a warning. There was this one night, a few years back, that sticks in my mind more than most. It was late, real late, past midnight, and I was out on patrol down by Highway 67, one of those empty stretches of road where the only thing you'll see is the occasional tumbleweed or the glow of a car's headlights in the distance. You get used to the quiet out here, but every now and then, something breaks that quiet in a way that shakes you to your core. I'd been out there for a few hours, just doing my rounds, checking for anything out of the ordinary. That night, though, it felt different. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place. There was a storm coming, I could feel it, but it wasn't the kind of storm you could see on the horizon. It was the kind of storm that settled in your bones and made your stomach turn. And that's when the call came in. A woman, late 20s, reported her car breaking down about 10 miles south of where I was. No one had seen her, but she said she could hear someone out there with her. She sounded frantic, like she was on the edge of losing it. Normally, I'd brush it off, maybe think she was just scared or imagining things. But something about the way she spoke, it caught my attention. I turned the cruiser around, the gravel crunching under the tires as I sped toward her location. The night was darker than usual, the sky clouded over and the moon barely poking through. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The radio was quiet, too quiet. No chatter, no reports, just the sound of my own breathing and the hum of the engine. It was the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. I finally reached the spot where she said she was, just off the road, and there it was. Her car, an old Chevy, parked in the middle of the dirt. But there was no woman, just the car. The engine was still running, its headlights shining out into the dark. No sign of anyone. I got out, hand on my gun, just in case. The air was cold and the wind had picked up a bit, but it still felt wrong, like the world was waiting for something. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. "Are you out here?" No answer, just the sound of the wind. I walked around the car, checking the doors. They were locked. I knocked on the window. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A low, almost inaudible sound. A whisper. It came from the trees just beyond the car. "Help me? Please?" I froze. The voice was soft, but it was real. It wasn't in my head. It was coming from somewhere out there in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and started moving toward the trees. I called out again, but there was no reply. I was careful, my hand still on my gun, ready for anything. I pushed through the brush, the undergrowth crackling under my boots. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't the woman, though. It was a man. His back was to me, and he was just standing there, still as a statue. "Hey, what the hell are you doing out here?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the trees. He didn't move, didn't respond. I took a few steps closer, trying to get a better look at his face, but something was wrong. His silhouette was all wrong, like it wasn't even real. It didn't make sense. The figure didn't seem to cast any shadows, and the light from my flashlight flickered as I shone it toward him. Then, without warning, he turned around. And that's when I saw it. His face wasn't a face at all. It was just smooth skin like a mannequin, with no features, no eyes, no nose, just smooth pale skin stretched over a skull. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud in the silence. The figure. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me with that empty, featureless face. I turned and ran, not caring about being quiet anymore. My boots slapped against the ground, my lungs burning as I pushed myself faster, back toward the car. I didn't dare look behind me. I could hear something moving, something following me, but I didn't dare stop. I reached the car, got in, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal. I didn't stop until I was back in town, back where people were, back where I could convince myself it wasn't real. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the road, watching me. I don't know what it was. Some kind of thing, I guess. A trick of the light. Or maybe it was something worse. Something that shouldn't have been out there in those woods, waiting. I went to the station and filed my report, but when I checked the map, there was no mention of the place I'd found her car. No place with those trees. It was like it never existed. I even had a couple of the guys go back with me the next day, but we found nothing. Not a trace of the woman, not a trace of the thing I saw. It's been years now, and I've tried to tell myself that I imagined it, that it was just a bad night, a little too much isolation and a little too much time on my hands. But the truth is, I don't know what I saw out there, and I don't know if it's gone. Sometimes when I'm out on patrol late at night, I see something in the distance, a shadow in the trees, a shape that doesn't quite make sense. And I know that whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting. And I wonder, maybe one day it'll find me again.